For 11,000 years, humanity looked up. We carved the constellations into clay. We built stone circles to track the sun. We aimed radio dishes at the dark and whispered hello into the void, over and over, the way a child knocks on a door they're terrified will actually open. Then one Tuesday morning in October, every alien signal in the known galaxy went dead. Not one, not a few, all of them. The Varelli choir gone. The Keth broadcast array that had been transmitting unbroken for 60,000 years, silent. The soft background hum of the galactic consensus, the loose federation of 47 civilizations that humanity had only recently been granted observer status in, not a whisper, silence. Total, absolute. SETI's servers flagged the anomaly at 3:14 a.m. By 3:17, every agency on Earth with a dish pointed at the sky was on the phone with every other agency. By 4 a.m., the calls stopped being about confirmation. They started being about what to do next. Here is what nobody in those early hours understood. What nobody could have understood, because there was no precedent, no chapter in any xenobiology textbook, no footnote in any diplomatic protocol that covered this scenario. Humanity wasn't supposed to be here right now. We were a young species, a noisy, chaotic, barely post-nuclear, still figuring it out species. We had been tolerated by the galactic consensus the way a family tolerates the youngest child at the adult table, with mild amusement and the quiet assumption that someone older would handle anything serious. And now every elder at the table was gone. The silence lasted 6 days before the first message arrived. It came not from the stars, but from a small automated probe that dropped out of fold space in the orbit of Jupiter, a probe stamped with the diplomatic seal of the Varelli. And inside it was a single data capsule, scorched at the edges, and a message so short it could be read in under 10 seconds. We could not hold them. We bought you what time we could. You are what remains. Do not mourn us. Become us. That was it. No explanation of who them was. No map. No instructions. No comfort. Just a door, kicked open, and darkness on the other side. And 8 billion humans on a small blue planet, staring up at a sky that had gone quiet overnight, about to discover something the rest of the galaxy had apparently already known, or feared, or bet their lives on. That when everything falls apart, when every great civilization crumbles and every ancient power goes dark, there is one species in the known universe that does not lie down, that has never, in its entire history, learned how. This is what happened next. Dr. Mara Ose had not slept in 41 hours when the second message arrived, and the first thing she noticed about it was the smell. That was the shock of the probe, not the technology. Though the fold space delivery system alone represented 100 years of human physics compressed into a casing the size of a microwave oven. Not the diplomatic seal, though the Varelli six-pointed mark had only ever appeared in humanity's xenological databases, never on an actual physical object that a human being could hold in their actual physical hands. No. What hit Mara first, standing in the middle of the Jupiter relay station's secondary bay in a borrowed jumpsuit 2 sizes too large, was the smell. Copper. Ash. Something organic underneath it that her brain kept misidentifying as old rain. The probe smelled like something had burned and then grieved. She had been a xenolinguist for 22 years. She had spent the first 12 of those years translating signals that weren't even confirmed as intelligent, pattern-matching exercises, probability trees, academic papers that other academics read and cited, and occasionally argued about at conferences in cities with good hotels. She had spent the last 10 years as the UN Xenolinguistic Liaison to the Galactic Consensus Observer Program, which was a title so long it barely fit on her badge and a job so new that she was essentially making it up as she went. She had prepared for first contact. She had run the simulations. She had read every theoretical framework ever written about how humanity would respond to confirmed alien intelligence. She had not prepared for last contact. The data capsule's message had already gone to every government on Earth within an hour of extraction. The words were simple enough, 11 words in Varelli's standard script that the translation matrices rendered in under a second. But simple words in the right order at the right moment have a way of restructuring everything, the way a single crack restructures ice. You are what remains. Do not mourn us. Become us. By the time Mara reached the UN Emergency Assembly Chamber in Geneva, a room designed for 200 and currently holding 612 people, with another 4,000 patched in remotely, the initial shock had begun its natural transformation. Shock becomes noise. Noise becomes argument. An argument, in a room full of frightened people with power, becomes something close to controlled catastrophe. The debate had fractured along 3 lines. The first faction said retreat, seal the relay stations, go dark. Whatever had silenced 47 galactic civilizations in a single night was not something humanity needed to introduce itself to. The species' best survival play was to make Earth look like an unoccupied rock. Buy time, think. The second faction said accelerate. The Varelli had bought them time. Use it. The Galactic Consensus's combined technological archive, accessible through observer status credentials humanity had held for 6 years but barely used, the way someone holds a library card and never quite gets around to going, contained resources that could advance human capability by centuries inside a decade. Mine it. Build. Become something worth the sacrifice that had been made. The third faction, smaller, quieter, but louder in the way that precise things are louder than volume, said they were asking the wrong question. Yusuf Kandun, 91 years old, and the longest-serving member of the Xenological Contact Ethics Board, had not raised his voice once in the 4 hours Mara had been in the chamber. He sat at the edge of the curved table in the front row, a small man in a dark suit, watching the argument with the expression of someone watching a river and already knowing where it goes. When he finally spoke, the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet for people who have earned silence. "We keep asking what they left us," he said. "We should be asking why they left it to us specifically. 47 civilizations. Some of them were here before the first fish pulled itself out of an ocean on this planet. They had resources we can barely conceptualize. Defense systems, allies, technology that makes our best efforts look like a child waving a stick. And something overwhelmed all of them." He paused. "The probe came to us. Not to empty space, not broadcast generally. It came to us with a seal, with a message, with a deliberate choice. Whatever the Varelli knew at the end, they chose us. That is the question. Not, what do we do? But what did they know about us that made us the answer?" Mara kept that question in her head for the next 72 hours like a splinter. Small, specific, impossible to ignore. She spent those hours in the archive. The Galactic Consensus Observer Archive was not a database in any sense that translated cleanly to human understanding. It was closer to a living record. A vast cross-indexed repository of 60,000 years of collective galactic history, contributed to and maintained by every member civilization, accessible through a translation interface that the consensus had built specifically for species at humanity's developmental level, simplified, contextualized, designed so that a young species could understand it without needing to first spend a century learning to understand the filing system. Most of humanity's scientists and diplomats had spent their observer years reading the sections on physics, biology, energy systems. The practical knowledge, the useful knowledge. Mara went looking for the history. Specifically, she went looking for every instance in the archive's 60,000-year record of a galactic power disappearing. There were more than she expected. Civilizations fell. That was not the surprise. The galaxy was old and civilizations fell the way trees fall, slowly at first, then comprehensively, and the forest continued around them. What Mara found, filtering through 914 documented cases of civilizational collapse, was a pattern she hadn't expected. The ones who survived were not the biggest. They were not the most technologically advanced. They were not the oldest, or the most diplomatically connected, or the most heavily defended. The civilizations that survived catastrophic galactic-scale events shared one trait, a single, specific, recurring characteristic that appeared across every successful case in the archive, spanning 60,000 years and dozens of unrelated species. They were the ones who had never, in their entire history, stopped adapting. Not just biologically, not just technologically, the archive's data was specific. The survivors adapted socially, culturally, psychologically. They were species that had faced near-extinction events, multiple near-extinction events, and each time had restructured not just what they did, but what they were. Their value systems bent without breaking. Their internal conflicts, rather than destroying them, had left them with a kind of structural flexibility that more stable civilizations never developed. Because stability, the archive noted in one of the driest and most devastating sentences Mara had ever read, was simply catastrophe in slow motion. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went and found Yusuf Kandun. He was in a small side room off the main chamber, eating soup from a paper cup, looking at nothing in particular. She sat across from him and put her tablet on the table between them, with the archive results on screen. He read it. He read it again. He looked up. "How long has humanity been on the archive?" he asked. 6 years of observer status. But the data they would have had access to about us goes back to our first radio transmissions. 112 years of direct observation. And before that? Indirect. Deep range monitoring. The consensus has been aware of Earth since roughly the development of complex civilization. Tens of thousands of years of data. Yusuf put down his soup. They watched us fight every war, watched every plague, every collapse and rebuild, every time we burned something to the ground and figured out a new way to be. Yes, and at the end, when everything else was gone, they sent the probe here. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the room, the argument was still going. Voices rising and falling. The endless recursive loop of people trying to make decisions about things they didn't yet understand. We're not the most powerful species in the galaxy, Yusuf said. We're not the oldest or the wisest or the best equipped. But we're the only ones who have been nearly destroyed so many times and kept deciding to be something different afterward. He picked up his soup again. They didn't choose us because we're strong. They chose us because we know how to be broken and then be something else. Mara looked at the archive data on her tablet. 60,000 years of galactic history. 914 civilizations. Every pattern the oldest minds in the galaxy had left behind. And at the end of all of it, a probe the size of a microwave oven, smelling of ash and old rain, dropping out of the dark to land in the orbit of a small planet where 8 billion people were currently very frightened and arguing very loudly. She thought about what the Varelli's last message hadn't said. It hadn't said good luck. It hadn't said we believe in you, or you can do this, or any of the soft reassurances that species apparently needed when handed civilizational responsibility by the dying. It had said become us. Not be like us. Not follow what we built. Become. Transform. The word choice in Varelli's standard script was specific. It used a root that meant radical structural change. The kind that makes the thing that emerges fundamentally different from the thing that went in. They weren't asking humanity to pick up where the consensus left off. They were asking humanity to be something the consensus couldn't be. Mara left the side room, walked back into the main chamber, and waited for a gap in the argument. Then she stood up and started talking about what she'd found. She talked for 40 minutes. The room was not quiet at first. Rooms with frightened, powerful people are rarely quiet for new voices, no matter what those voices are saying. But the archive data was 60,000 years of the galaxy's own record. Not a theory, not a model, not a projection. It was history. Documented, cross-referenced, contributed by civilizations that had now gone dark and left this as part of what they left behind. People stopped talking. People started listening. Not because Mara was persuasive. She knew she wasn't, particularly. But because the data was the kind of thing that, once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. The pattern was too clean, too consistent, too specifically pointed at something that humanity had been doing without knowing it was notable for its entire existence. The retreat faction went quiet first, then the accelerate faction. Then even the third, small, precise faction seemed to settle into something that felt like, not agreement, exactly, but orientation. The beginning of a shared direction. They were not going to hide. They were not going to simply raid the archive for weapons. They were going to do the thing that every survivor in the archive had done. They were going to take the break. The seismic, total, overnight break in everything they had understood about the galaxy and their place in it. And they were going to decide what they were going to be on the other side of it. Not yet. It was too early for that. There was too much they didn't know. What had silenced the consensus? Where it was? Whether it was coming? Whether the time the Varelli had bought was measured in years, or months, or weeks. But the arguing stopped, and in the stopping, something else started. Quieter, more serious. The kind of collective hush that falls over a species when it understands, for the first time at a cellular level, that it is genuinely on its own. Mara walked out of the chamber at 2 a.m. and stood in the long corridor outside, all glass and steel, and the dark Geneva sky beyond it, and looked up. The stars were still there. They hadn't gone anywhere. They just weren't talking anymore. But they were watching. She could feel it, not literally, not in any scientific sense her colleagues would have accepted without argument, but in the way you feel the weight of a room full of people who have stopped speaking and started waiting. The galaxy had gone quiet. And into that silence, whether they were ready or not, humanity was going to have to speak. She went to find coffee. She was going to need a lot of it. They all were. Because in 6 hours, the first working group session was scheduled to begin. Not a debate, not an assembly, not a forum. A working group. Small, cross-disciplinary, 9 people handpicked from the Archive Access Team and the Xenolinguistics Division and the military's Deep Space Response Unit, who were going to sit in a room together and start building the thing that came next. Mara was on the list. She hadn't been asked. Her name had simply appeared on the roster when she checked her tablet on the way to the elevator. She stared at it for a moment. Then she thought about the probe and the ash smell and the 11 words that had restructured everything. She thought about become. She pressed the button for the floor with the good coffee machine. It was going to be a long night. It was going to be a long series of nights. There would be failures ahead. She was certain of that because the archive was full of failures, because survival was not a clean process and never had been for any species that had managed it. But she was already doing the math in her head, already turning over what the archive had shown her, looking for the edges of it, the parts that didn't fit neatly, the places where humanity's particular and specific history of catastrophe and reinvention might map onto what the galaxy needed now. The elevator opened. She stepped out. Down the hall, through a glass door, the lights of the working group room were already on. Two people she didn't recognize yet were already inside, tablets open, heads bent together over something. She paused in the doorway. The stars outside the windows were silent and still and watching. She went in. 3 months after the silence, humanity did something it had never done before in its entire history. It agreed. Not on everything. Humanity agreeing on everything would have been a sign that something had gone badly wrong, that someone was forcing the agreement rather than finding it. The disagreements were still there, still loud, still occasionally degenerating into the kind of international argument that required diplomatic staff to work through the night. But underneath the arguing, in the places where it mattered, in the rooms where the actual decisions were being made, there was something that hadn't existed before October, a direction. The working group that had started with 9 people in a Geneva conference room at 2 a.m. had grown, in the way that urgent things grow when nobody stops them. Carefully, then comprehensively, then faster than anyone was tracking. Within 3 weeks it was 40 people. Within 6 weeks it was 300, broken into specialized divisions, each one eating through the Galactic Consensus archive from a different angle. They called it the Remnant Project, not for drama, for accuracy. They were the remnant. The word had been Yusuf Kandin's, and it had stuck the way words stick when they are true. Mara ran the Linguistic and Cultural Intelligence Division, which was a polite name for the team trying to answer a question with no clean answer. What exactly had the Galactic Consensus been, and what had it needed that it had not been able to provide itself? Because the archive was clear on one thing. The consensus had not been taken by surprise. Whatever had moved through the galaxy in the days before the silence, the Varelli had known it was coming. Their last transmission, the probe, was not a desperate last-second act. It was planned, prepared. The probe had been built months before it was launched. The data capsule had been assembled with care. They had chosen Earth deliberately, and they had had time to make the choice. That meant they had looked at what was coming, looked at everything they had, looked at every ally and resource and defense system the 47 civilization consensus could bring to bear, and decided it wasn't enough. And then they had looked somewhere else. At a small planet, a young species, loud, argumentative, historically violent, still burning carbon and arguing about economics, and unable to agree on basic governance across its own single world, and said, them. Mara needed to understand why with a precision that went beyond what the archive explicitly said, because the archive told her what, and it told her the pattern, but it didn't tell her the mechanism. It didn't tell her what specific quality in humanity had made the Varelli make that bet. And she needed to know because whatever it was the thing they had to lean into, hard, deliberately, on purpose. She found part of the answer in a sub-archive she almost missed. It was catalogued under Consensus Internal Communications. Not the official record, the diplomatic and scientific exchanges, but the internal equivalent of memos and working notes, the informal record of what member civilizations had actually thought about each other over the decades. Most species' internal records were guarded, marked restricted, accessible only under specific research protocols. The Varelli's internal records were open, all of them. Everything going back 4,000 years. Unrestricted access, granted without annotation, as if whoever had prepared the final archive package had deliberately unlocked the door and stepped back. Mara went in. What she found was not what she expected, and it took her 2 weeks to process it well enough to present to the full working group. The Varelli had been watching Earth for a long time, longer than the observer status period, longer than the radio transmissions. The first mention of Earth in the Varelli's internal records was 4,300 years ago, a brief notation in a deep-range survey flagging the presence of a biologically complex world with the beginnings of organized social structure. Standard observation. The consensus did it with every world that crossed the relevant thresholds. But Earth kept coming up. Not prominently. Not in any way that would have been visible from the outside as special attention. But in the Varelli's internal debates and strategy discussions, and the quiet decades-long arguments that member civilizations had with each other about the shape of the galaxy's future, Earth, and specifically humanity, appeared again and again. Because humanity kept doing something that the consensus found, depending on the internal records period, alternately baffling, alarming, inspiring, and ultimately irreplaceable. Humanity kept surviving things that the models said it shouldn't. The Bronze Age collapse, the Black Death, the 2 world wars followed by the invention of weapons capable of sterilizing the planet, which were then not used. The ecological crises of the early 21st century, which had looked, from the Varelli's long-range modeling, like an extinction-level trajectory for approximately 40 years before they didn't. The 3 near-miss asteroid events between 2031 and 2089, the Cascadia sequence. The Istanbul convergence. Every time the Varelli's models had flagged Earth as a high-probability casualty within a given time frame. Every time the models had been wrong. Not because humanity had been lucky, though luck had been part of it, but because humanity's response to crisis didn't follow the pattern that the consensus's models were built on. The rational optimization-based models developed by studying civilizations that had grown more stable and predictable as they aged. Humanity didn't optimize under pressure. It improvised, it argued. It threw out the plan halfway through and did something nobody had modeled, because nobody had thought to model it. It made mistakes, and then made different mistakes, and then, in the gap between the 2 sets of mistakes, accidentally discovered something that worked. The Varelli had a word for it in their internal records. Mara's translation matrix rendered it as approximately the species that falls correctly. Not gracefully, not efficiently, but correctly in the sense that the falling always against probability ended in a landing rather than an impact. She brought this to the full working group, standing at the head of a table that now held 47 people. 1 for each fallen consensus civilization. A coincidence that nobody had planned, and that everyone had noticed, and that nobody had yet figured out whether to find meaningful or just haunting. She walked them through the archive. She showed them the models and the deviations. She showed them 4,300 years of a galaxy-spanning civilization quietly, internally marveling at a species that kept not dying when the math said it should. The room was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then Commander Leila Nazari, who ran the military division of the Remnant Project and who had the specific kind of composure that comes from spending 20 years making decisions about things that could kill large numbers of people, said, "So what you're telling us is that our greatest strategic asset is our inability to behave predictably." Essentially, yes. And that the thing that is out there, the thing that took out 47 civilizations in a night, presumably operates on models, predictions, pattern recognition. That's my read of the archive evidence, yes. Nazari was quiet for another moment. Then she looked around the table. "Well," she said, with the flat, dry delivery of someone who had moved past irony into something more useful. "That's the first good news we've had. The thing that had silenced the consensus, they had no name for it yet, no confirmed description, only the negative space of its actions, and the fragments of data in the final transmissions of civilizations that had not quite had time to send more, operated on a logic that the archive survivors had documented across dozens of historical precedents. It was not malevolent in any emotional sense. It did not hate. It assessed. It calculated. It identified civilizations that posed potential long-term resistance to its expansion and removed them with a precision that left no meaningful debris, because precision at its scale was simply efficient. What it had never encountered, the archive suggested in the records of the last civilizational survivors in each historical case, was a species that could not be modeled, not because they were chaotic. Randomness was modelable, not because they were irrational. Irrationality had patterns too. But because humanity's specific brand of adaptive, crisis-driven, argument-fueled, wrong twice before getting it right survival strategy produced outcomes that even the most sophisticated predictive architecture had consistent trouble anticipating. The Varelli had known this. At the end, they had bet on it. The Remnant Project shifted after that meeting. Not completely. The archive work continued, the technological extraction accelerated, the diplomatic teams worked around the clock to establish contact with whatever other remnants might be out there. The scattered survivors of smaller consensus member worlds who had been below the threat threshold, who were alive and frightened and in need of something to orient toward. But the core strategy lopped into something clearer. They were not going to build a weapon. Not in the conventional sense. They were going to build a presence. A visible, active, unpredictable, galactically loud human presence that would do what humanity did. Show up, make noise, make mistakes, adapt in real time, improvise under pressure, and be genuinely impossible to model accurately because they were genuinely impossible to model accurately. They were going to be bait, in the purest sense, not helpless bait that bit back. Bait that had spent 4,000 years accidentally running stress tests on its own survival capacity and had, against every reasonable prediction, kept passing them. The first human deep space vessels had been in development for 20 years under the UN Space Expansion Charter, slow, expensive, carefully scheduled. Within the remnant project's first month, every relevant national space agency and private aerospace organization on Earth had been folded into a single accelerated program. They were using the archive's physics, not copying, adapting, taking consensus propulsion theory and running it through human engineering teams who had very specific instructions to find the ways it could be modified, improved, broken productively, rebuilt differently. The first 3 ships launched 8 weeks after the Geneva Assembly. They were not impressive by consensus standards. The archive contained vessel specifications that made them look like kayaks next to container ships. But they were fast. They were armed with hybrid weapon systems that combined consensus energy principles with human ballistic engineering in ways that the archive had no classification for. And they were crewed by people who had been selected not for their compliance with operational parameters, but for their documented history of making the right call in situations the parameters hadn't anticipated. Mara was on the second ship. She hadn't been asked. Her name had simply appeared on the crew manifest. She noticed the pattern and decided not to find it unsettling. The ship was called the Tumataiti, a name from a language that had mapped stars before Europe built its first cathedral, chosen specifically because it meant something about being small and not caring. The crew of 41 called it the Tumata after the first week and didn't bother with the rest. The mission was contact. Specifically, find the remnant survivors of consensus member worlds, establish communication, offer what humanity was building, and start constructing the network that the fallen consensus had been and that something needed to be again. The galaxy was not empty. It was frightened. There was a difference. In the first 2 weeks of flight, the Tumata made contact with 3 separate survivor groups, fragments of consensus member worlds that had been off-site when the silence hit, or on the periphery, or simply below the threshold of whatever calculation had decided what needed to be removed. They were not large groups. They were not, in most cases, in good shape, but they were alive, and they were watching the human ships with the particular intensity of people who have been sitting in the dark for 3 months and have just seen a light. Mara ran the contact protocols for all 3. The translation matrices handled the linguistics. The actual contact, the part that mattered, the part that built the thing that needed to be built, was something else. The third group they found were Keith. 612 of them on a deep space research station that had been 11 light years from their home system when the silence hit. Their home system was gone, not damaged, gone, in the precise total way that the thing in the dark operated. 612 people, in a station designed for a crew of 80, rationing everything and maintaining the station's systems with a discipline that Mara found quietly devastating because it was the discipline of people who had decided to keep going without knowing why yet. She spent 4 hours in communication with their senior surviving diplomat, a woman named Vel Kareth, whose title translated approximately as the one who speaks when speaking costs something. And at the end of those 4 hours, Vel Kareth said something in Keth that Mara's matrix rendered as, "We did not expect humans to come." "Why not?" Mara asked. A pause. "Because we thought you were too young, too small." 2. Another pause. The matrix flagged the next word as culturally complex, offering 3 possible translations. The first was unformed. The second was incomplete. The third was still becoming. Mara looked at all 3 for a moment. "Yes," she said. "That's the point." Vel Kareth was quiet for a long time. Then she said something the matrix rendered with unusual confidence, as if there were no ambiguity in it at all. "Then perhaps there is a reason the Varelli chose you after all." Outside the Tumata's observation windows, the galaxy was dark and vast and full of frightened people in small surviving pockets, waiting to see what humanity was going to do next. Behind them, back on a small blue planet, 8 billion people were arguing about it. Building things, breaking things, arguing some more, adapting in real time in the specific, irreducible, unpredictable way they had always adapted, falling correctly as the Varelli had noted across 4,000 years of careful private observation. Ahead of them, somewhere in the dark, something that operated on logic and models and precise, sufficient calculation was continuing its work. It had not yet turned its attention to Earth. When it did, it would find a species that had spent its entire existence preparing for exactly this moment without knowing it. Not with weapons, not with walls, with the specific, stubborn, improvised 4,000-year field-tested capacity to be something unexpected. Mara pressed her forehead briefly against the cold observation glass. The stars were still silent. But the tomato was moving through them, making noise, and somewhere in the deep dark, other ships were doing the same. The galaxy had gone quiet. Humanity hadn't, and that, it turned out, was everything. It came on a Wednesday. Nobody had planned it that way. The thing in the dark did not consult calendars, and would not have cared if it had. But it was a Wednesday, 1432 GMT, 7 months after the silence, and Mara was eating a very bad sandwich in the Tomatoes galley when the proximity alarm filled the ship with a sound that was less a sound than a physical fact, a vibration in the hull that the body registered before the brain did. She was on the bridge in 40 seconds. What she saw on the long-range sensors was not a fleet. It was not a formation. It was a geometry, a precise multi-dimensional arrangement of something that the sensor array was having difficulty classifying because it existed partly in normal space and partly in something adjacent to it, like a hand pressed against a window from the other side, visible through the glass but not quite there. Commander Nazari, who had transferred to the Tumata 6 weeks earlier when it became clear that the diplomatic mission and the military calculus were too intertwined to keep separate, was already at her station. She looked at the sensor data with the expression she used for situations where her training was relevant but insufficient. 40 minutes to intercept range, said the navigation officer, Piotr, who had been a competitive chess player before he became the best fold space navigator in the first generation of human deep space crew, and who had a habit of solving unprecedented problems with the same focused calm he applied to endgames. "Is this it?" someone asked. Mara didn't look to see who. "It matches the archive's documented approach signatures," she said. Her translation matrix was already pulling every relevant record from the consensus archive, every civilization that had encountered this, every piece of data anyone had managed to transmit before the end. The geometry. The fold space integration. Yes, this is it. The bridge was quiet. Then Nazari said, "Send the signal." The signal had been prepared for 3 months. It was not a weapon. It was not a surrender. It was the most human document ever constructed in the history of the species, which was a significant bar given the competition, and it had been written collaboratively by 49 people from 22 different nations who had argued, with tremendous intensity, about almost every word in it for approximately 7 weeks. It was not, in other words, a precise document. It was a specific, slightly irrational, genuinely impossible to model document. Not to Earth, not to humanity's military capabilities, though those were referenced. Not to humanity's observer status credentials with the galactic consensus, though those were included. The introduction was to humanity's history, a compressed, dense, carefully chosen sequence of events from the last 12,000 years that had one thing in common. Every event in the sequence was a time humanity had been told it was finished, and hadn't been. The Bronze Collapse, the Plague Years, the first and second nuclear crises, the cascading ecological failures of the early 21st century, the internal wars, the external threats. The moments documented and verifiable across 12,000 years of recorded human history, where the probability of the species' continuation had dropped below thresholds that the consensus's own archive flagged as functionally terminal. And then, the recovery. Each time, different every time, never the same strategy, never the same mechanism, never the pattern that a predictive model could have anticipated if it had been running on the previous data. Because humanity's adaptations were not derivatives of its history, they were departures from it. The message didn't say, "We will fight you." It didn't say, "You cannot destroy us." It said, in the specific, loaded, 2-word subtext style that Mara had by now come to understand, was humanity's most honest communicative mode. "We're still here. With evidence, 12,000 years of evidence." The signal went out. The geometry and the sensors continued its approach. 40 minutes? What happened in those 40 minutes was not what Mara had expected. Though she would have been hard-pressed to say precisely what she had expected, she had read every account in the archive of species that had faced this, and almost none of them had had 40 minutes. The ones that had had time had spent it on final transmissions, on preserving records, on the elegant, grief-heavy business of saying what needed to be said before the silence. Humanity spent 14 of the 40 minutes arguing about whether to change the signal. Piotr wanted to add navigational data. The engineer, Amar, thought the historical sequence should be reordered. 2 people in the communications bay got into a genuine disagreement about translation framing that escalated to the point where Nazari had to raise her voice, which she almost never did. At minute 23, the geometry stopped. Not slowed, stopped. A complete, abrupt cessation of movement that the sensors flagged as anomalous because objects of its scale did not stop that way. Not in normal space, not in fold space integration, not in any physical model that the archive covered. The bridge went entirely silent. "What is it doing?" someone asked. "Reading," Mara said. She didn't know that with certainty. But it was the right word. It was reading the signal. More than that, it was processing it. The archive had documented this entity's encounter patterns extensively, across dozens of civilizations. Its decision-making process was fast. Civilizations from the archive had reported time to engagement measured in minutes from first contact. It had been at rest for 17 minutes now. At minute 31, it sent a response. Not to Earth, not a broadcast. A directed transmission, narrow beam, aimed specifically at the Tomata. Mara's translation matrix took 6 seconds to render it, which was the longest she had ever seen it take for a transmission of any length. And when it finished, she read it twice before she said it aloud. "It says, this is not a known pattern." The bridge absorbed that. "Is that good?" Pyotr asked. "In every archive case where something was a known pattern," Mara said carefully, "it was destroyed." "So statistically, yes, it seems to be good." The geometry remained still for 11 more minutes. Then it sent a second transmission. This one was longer, much longer. The matrix took 90 seconds. When it finished, Mara read through the rendered text with the focus of someone diffusing something, and when she looked up, her expression was the kind that happens when a human brain encounters something it doesn't yet have a category for. "It's asking a question," she said. "What question?" She looked at the screen. "It's asking how, what, how we're still here." She set down the tablet. "It runs predictive models. It has been running predictive models on humanity since we began broadcasting. The models indicated, multiple times, across multiple assessment periods, that the species should have ended." She paused. "It wants to know what the models missed." The bridge was quiet in a way that was different from all the previous quiets. Not the quiet of fear, not the quiet of shock, but the specific, strange, slightly dazed quiet of people who have just understood something enormous. They were not looking at a weapon that couldn't be fought. They were looking at a system that couldn't understand what it was looking at, and it had stopped to ask. Mara thought about Yusuf Kandon's question from 7 months ago. Not what do we do, but what did they know about us? She thought about 4,000 years of Varelli internal records and the word they had used for humanity, the species that falls correctly. She thought about the archive's 914 case studies and the single trait that the survivors had in common, not power, not technology, not size, but the specific, unglamorous, exhausting capacity to be broken and become something different afterward. She thought about the signal they'd sent, 12,000 years of evidence. Not "we are strong, but we are still here." The particular stubbornness of the phrase, the way it didn't make a claim about the future, or issue a challenge or offer a defense, but just stated a fact that the math kept contradicting, over and over, and yet there it was. She thought about how you answer a question like, "How are you still here?" to something that operates on models and logic and precise calculation. You couldn't answer it in a way it would understand. That was the point. That was the whole point. So she wrote back the only honest thing. She wrote, "We don't know either. We just keep deciding too." The Matrix flagged 2 of her words as culturally untranslatable and offered alternatives. She declined the alternatives. She sent it as written, untranslatable words and all. The geometry was still for 4 minutes. Then it moved, not toward the Tomata, not toward Earth, but sideways, in the fold space sense, shifting into the adjacent dimension it partly occupied, the sensor readings destabilizing and then resolving into a different configuration. Not a retreat, not an attack. A pause. The kind of processing pause that, when Mara described it in her report later, she used the word recalculation, and then looked at the word for a long time before deciding it was right. It recalculated for 6 hours, 17 minutes, and 43 seconds. Then it sent a third transmission. This one the Matrix rendered instantly. 3 words if you counted the Varelli standard script loanword as 1 word, which technically it wasn't, but which meant something that no other language in the archive had a single term for. It said, "You are anomalous." And then, "We will observe." And then it was gone. Not destroyed, not fled, simply no longer present in this region of space in the same way it had been, folded away into the adjacent dimension with no indication of when or whether it would return. The sensors showed nothing. Normal space. Stars. The bridge stayed quiet for almost a minute. Then Pyotr made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and wasn't quite a sob, and was possibly both at once. which was such a specific and distinctly human sound that 3 of the non-human crew members they'd taken on at the Keth station turned to look at him with expressions that their faces weren't quite built to show curiosity through, but which Mara had learned to read anyway. "So," said Nazari after another moment, "we're an anomaly." "Apparently," Mara said. "An anomaly it decided to observe instead of remove, apparently, because we couldn't explain how we survived, and because the question itself didn't fit its models." Mara looked at the empty sensor screen. "It models everything. It plans based on models. It removes things that its models classify as long-term resistance risks. And we are, apparently, a species that it cannot model accurately enough to classify." Nazari thought about that. "So our primary defensive capability," she said slowly, "is that we're confusing. Our primary defensive capability is that we are genuinely, documentably, demonstrably uncertain, in ways that no predictive system has yet successfully accounted for, which in the context of something that makes life or death decisions based on predictive modeling, yes, effectively means we're confusing." Nazari looked at the screen for another long moment. Then she sat down, which she rarely did on the bridge, and rubbed her face with both hands. "Yusuf is going to say he told us so," she said. "Yes," Mara agreed, "he absolutely is." The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing that came after was simple. The thing in the dark, they still had no agreed name for it, and at some point the working group had begun calling it simply the Silence, which was less a name than a description, and which everyone was quietly aware was not adequate, but which was not gone. It was observing. What it was doing with its observations was unknown. Whether we will observe was a permanent statement or a temporary reprieve was unknown. Whether there were conditions that would cause it to re-engage was unknown. A great deal was unknown. But contact had been made. Contact that had not ended in the way that 47 other contacts had ended. And in the space that the observation created, not peace, not safety, but a space that was at least not immediate destruction, things began to grow. The survivor network expanded. The Keth station, resupplied and reinforced, became a waypoint. Other stations, other fragments, other small groups of beings who had been on the edges of the consensus when the silence hit, began to orient toward the small, loud, argumentative species that had apparently talked the thing in the dark into watching instead of moving. There was no ceremony, there was no formal declaration. It happened the way most real things happen, incrementally, through accumulated small decisions made by individuals in specific rooms on specific days, each one doing the thing that seemed right in the immediate moment without knowing that all of it added up to something. But something was being built, not the galactic consensus. They were not trying to recreate that, and the archive was clear that recreating what had fallen was never the path the survivors took. Something different, something with a human fingerprint on it, more chaotic than the consensus had been, more argumentative, more willing to make decisions that the models said were wrong and see what happened, more comfortable with uncertainty as an operating condition rather than a problem to be solved before proceeding. Mara wrote her full report in the Two-Mata's small cabin while the ship made its way back toward Earth, where she would present it to the working group, and then to the assembly, and then to the world, and where another long sequence of arguments would begin, all of them necessary, most of them productive, and none of them, she suspected, going exactly the way anyone modeled. She wrote the last line of the report and looked at it for a while. What the Varelli knew, and what the silence could not account for, is that humanity is not a species that survives because it is powerful, or because it is wise, or because it has been lucky. Though all of these things have been partially true at various times, humanity survives because it has never, in its entire history, developed the capacity to accept that survival is impossible. This is not a strategy, it is a nature. And in the specific conditions created by the silence, where the galaxy needed something that could not be predicted, could not be modeled, could not be solved for, that nature is the only thing that was ever going to matter. She sent the report. She went to the observation bay and looked at the stars, still silent, still dark, but less emptily so, because she knew now what was out there. Frightened people building things, uncertain of the outcome, adapting as they went, falling in the specific way that ends in landings rather than impacts. The galaxy had lost its elders in a single night. What grew in their place was going to be noisier, more uncertain, more prone to error and argument, and the specific productive chaos that comes from a species that has never quite managed to agree on anything completely. It was going to be alive in the particular way that only things that have almost died multiple times manage to be alive, with the knowledge of the alternative and the choice made over and over in specific rooms on specific days by specific people to keep going anyway. The Tumata moved through the silent stars. Behind it, a network of lights, small, scattered, surviving, was beginning to map itself against the dark. Ahead, Earth turned its blue face toward a sky that had gone quiet overnight, and on it 8 billion people were getting up and making coffee and arguing and building things and making mistakes and adapting in the only way they knew how. Still here, still deciding to be.